Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and beat 'em ups have always been one of my favorite genres when it comes to video games. I've always thought that they were some of the most colorful, some of the most mesmerizing and memorable games that I had ever played. A lot of it centered around their story. Usually, there was some really deep story about how you needed to save a family member or rescue the city that had been taken over by some type of criminal syndicate. And no matter what the case, from pretty much Gen 3 to Gen 4, beat 'em ups, almost every beat 'em up seemed amazing to me. But then something happened in Gen 5. Around the time of Gen 5, we started to see the introduction of 3D beat 'em ups. And in Gen 5, because we were transitioning from like the 2D format to some of the first 3D formats, I just remember as a kid thinking, this does not look good. We have some examples from the fifth generation. So if you look at a console like the Sega Saturn released both 2D and 3D beat 'em up games that were both well received for the most part, but I feel like for me personally, one stands out a bit more than the other in terms of a beat 'em up experience. Now you have Die Hard Arcade, which Die Hard Arcade would probably be considered one of the first 3D beat 'em ups of its generation. There are probably others. I'm not a gaming historian. I'm just talking about the games that I experienced. And for me, Die Hard Arcade was one of the first 3D beat 'em ups that I experienced actually in the arcade, because I never had a Sega Saturn growing up, but I did play Die Hard in the arcade. But if you also look, the Sega Saturn also had a game that released on it called Guardian Heroes. Now, neither of these games, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think either of these games have released on any other console. But for me personally, the beat 'em up experience that I got from Guardian Heroes was way better than the experience that I got from Die Hard in terms of a home console beat 'em up experience. Now, obviously, Guardian Heroes, at least I don't think it ever released in the arcades, but I know Die Hard did release in the arcades. And from an arcade perspective, and by arcade, I mean like you're standing in an arcade store, you're playing the arcade games, Die Hard for sure was a great experience. But at home, once you play through it a few times, it kind of loses its luster. It's definitely one of those games that you have more fun playing in the arcades. Whereas Guardian Heroes is a 2D side-scrolling beat 'em up game that you kind of just want to play over and over again, and you want to use different characters, you want to try different pathways, different storylines, and because there are those like, RPG elements to it where you can add different attributes to the character, it just felt like a better gameplay experience. And I just remember seeing that transition when the fifth generation came around, to where companies were moving away from this 2D beat 'em up format and going for more 3D options. Another example of like a 3D beat 'em up would be like a game that we saw on the PlayStation 1 in Gekido. Gekido 2 was one of the first fifth generation beat 'em ups that I got to experience. And while the gameplay is cool and it's fun, it still just doesn't have the visual appeal to me of a 2D beat 'em up. Same thing with Fighting Force 64, which plays a lot like Gekido. These 3D beat 'em up games, I felt like they didn't hit as hard, and they weren't as impactful because the 3D renderings that we got during the fifth generation just didn't feel good. And it was hard to compare games, like Gekido and Die Hard, to some of the classics like Final Fight 3, a classic and beautiful beat 'em up, or even something older than that, like a Shatterhand on the NES. Shatterhand isn't as graphically intricate, but for what it was at the time, it definitely offered a better gameplay experience to me, just because of the different features that you had. You could use different weapons and arm your fist with different types of weapons that had different attacks based on the I don't want to call them ingredients, but based on like the chips that you combined. And then even if you continue with the fourth generation, I mean, you had beat 'em ups like the Punisher, which we got on the Capcom collection. And then you also have, in my opinion, the greatest beat 'em up of all time, Streets of Rage 2. So it was really hard to come out with, something that could, uproot or surpass a Streets of Rage 2 in my mind. For me personally, I just felt like Streets of Rage 2 was the epitome of what a good beat 'em up should be. Colorful characters, colorful backgrounds, a very cool setting, amazing music, good voice sound effects, good beat 'em up sound effects, different weapons, different special attacks. It wasn't too much and it wasn't too little. I felt like Streets of Rage was always the perfect balance of difficulty as well. And obviously you can always increase that, but Streets of Rage 2 was just the epitome. And I never really thought that I never thought two things. I never thought that there would be a beat 'em up as good or better than Streets of Rage 2, and I never really thought that gaming companies would improve on the 3D beat 'em up genre. Now we have seen attempts at better 3D beat 'em ups than what we got from the fifth generation. I mean, just one generation later, if you look at the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox generation, we got games like Final Fight Streetwise, which still wasn't anything to write home about in terms of a beat 'em up experience. It wasn't the most fun gameplay experience. In fact, the fighting in this game is pretty clumsy. But then you got something like God Hand, which from a fighting perspective, in terms of fighting moves and different things like that, God Hand technically is a very good fighting game, but it lacks a lot of the openness that you would expect from a beat 'em up. It doesn't feel like a very open beat 'em up world. It feels extremely linear. The levels and the area in which you play feels very sparse. It doesn't really feel like a lot that you can interact with. It's not like a Shadow of the Colossus where you feel completely immersed in the world that you're in. God Hand, outside of the fighting and the combat, there really was a lot that was left to be desired when it comes to the overall gameplay experience. And then you had games like Spike Out Battle Street, which came out for the Xbox, which was exceptional in its own right because it did have a lot of the stuff that I mentioned in Streets of Rage 2 in terms of solid combat, decent music, and actually a pretty interesting storyline. But it was so short. The game didn't have a lot of depth that you would see from a lot of those multi-level beat 'em ups from the Gen 4, Gen 3 era. And this is just, again, my personal opinion. This is just how I felt about it. Now, once we got, to the Gen 7 era, that's when I would say that, 3D imaging and 3D graphics started to really reach their peak. Um, Obviously, we've made improvements since the 7th gen, because you have the 8th gen with like the PlayStation 4 and the Switch, which has improved a lot on um, the graphics and things like that. And then you've obviously got the PS5, which takes it to another level. But there are certain exceptions that I would say that come pretty close to the 2D beat 'em up experience. And an example of that for me would be a game like Azura's Wrath. Azura's Wrath has a combination of fighting styles between on-rail shooter kind of quick time events throughout the game, and then obviously you have this kind of third person like beat 'em up mode that you go into for certain aspects of the game. And I think when you combine the storyline, just the plot of the game, the characters, the scenery, the graphics, the music, this is definitely a game that takes, I think, 3D beat 'em up action to the max to me, personally, for a 7th gen game. And I think, this is definitely a huge step up from something that we would have saw in like a Die Hard or a Gekido. But it still, to me, does not replace the traditional 2D beat 'em up. And the best example that I have of something like that is River City Girls, which, if I had to say the best beat 'em up of all time, for me personally, I have to put River City Girls right up there with Streets of Rage 2, because it takes all of the the graphics that we love about that generation. It polishes it up, and then it incorporates a much more intricate and open 2D world, right? So it's not just linear where you're scrolling from left to right. You can go up certain pathways, down certain pathways, into shops. You can get on the train. You can ride the bus. You can go into different stores and buy clothing or buy candy or buy food. You can buy items. The amount of depth that they add to this beat 'em up, for it to be a 2D beat 'em up at that, I think is amazing. And you know, it just goes to show what effort can get you when it comes to creating a beat 'em up, because we've seen other beat 'em ups. In fact, and I've had a number of beat 'em ups on the Switch, from the Jay and Silent Bob beat 'em up to I recently picked up the Karate Kid. I haven't played that yet, but a lot of the beat 'em ups that we see come out, even on modern consoles, are very basic. They pretty much follow the same format that we saw decades ago, which to me was groundbreaking decades ago. But River City Girls just takes all of the ingenuity of like today's time and jams it into this amazing looking 2D format, which I think is almost like the perfect beat 'em up. So these are just my thoughts. I feel like 2D beat 'em ups in general are better than 3D beat 'em ups. I think they just play better and feel better for what the genre is. But I'm interested to know your guys' thoughts and what you think about, you know, the difference between a 2D beat 'em up versus a 3D beat 'em up. Which one do you prefer, and which one do you find yourself playing a lot more easily? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.